Hello everyone, this is Dr. Golding again, and so today we're going to continue with our discussion of Plato, and in particular today we're going to talk about Plato's theory of the good. I've been saying over and over how important Plato's theory of the good is in his theory. Wisdom, which is the intellectual virtue, the virtue of the rational part of the soul, includes the knowledge of the true and the good, right? And so last time we talked about how knowledge of the true, what that means according to Plato is knowledge of the forms, okay? The forms are the true eternal essences of all things. Remember that anytime you have a group of things which has some property in common, Plato's going to say there is an essence that is the form which all of those particular things partake in. Okay, so we talked about the form of triangularity, and we talked about the form of beauty. All beautiful things, all particular beautiful things are merely examples of beautiful things, and Plato thinks that there is an essence which all beautiful things have in common, and that would be what he calls the form of beauty, and so on for any essence or nature that a number of things have in common. There's going to be a form. That form is going to be eternal and everlasting. It's going to be a perfect entity of whatever it is. So beauty itself is beauty, perfect beauty, rather than simply something that is sort of beautiful or beautiful in one way or another. Anyway, that was the theory of the forms. That's what we talked about in the last lecture. So today what we're going to get to is Plato's theory of the good. Now, in the Republic, which is the selection from which the reading comes, so at one point, Socrates' friends, companions, of course, again, Socrates is the speaker presenting what either is his own views or Plato's views. Again, we don't distinguish between Plato and Socrates for the purpose of this class. But essentially, Socrates is the character who's talking, and his friends ask him, you've been talking about the good every now and then. You've emphasized how important it is to know the good, because it's through knowledge of the good that a ruler will be a good ruler, that an individual soul will be able to be a virtuous soul. What is the good? Will you tell us already, what is the good? And in the dialogue, Socrates says, the good is just so profound, it's so amazing, it's like the most unbelievable thing. I can't even explain it in words, literally. I can't directly explain what the good is. That's how special the good is. However, what I can do is give you a parable or an analogy, a metaphor to understand what the good is. And that's where Socrates comes up with what is sometimes called the allegory of the cave. Now, I have asked you to, of course, do the reading and also watch that little animated version of Socrates' allegory of the cave. So I'm going to assume that you have done that. And so I'm going to hit upon certain aspects of the allegory, but not in the same gory detail that you have both in the reading and in the video that I asked you to watch. So again, if you haven't watched it yet, I would recommend that before you listen to the rest of this lecture, you go ahead and watch the animated version of Socrates' allegory of the cave. But summarizing it briefly, I would say that, sometimes it's called, like I said, the allegory of the cave, but a better name would be the allegory of the cave and the sun. Sun, S-U-N, okay? The allegory of the cave and the sun. Because in the allegory, it really is not the cave, but the sun that represents the good, okay? So let's just talk a little bit about the allegory for a few minutes, or the story, the parable, and then we'll try to understand what is the meaning of this parable? Okay, so the allegory, of course, involves you imagine someone or some group of people who are inside a cave. And they're chained in such a way that they're facing the inner wall of the cave. They're chained, sitting, facing the inner wall of the cave. Now, the cave is not completely dark. There's some interesting things going on in that cave. Behind where they're sitting, there is some kind of a fire burning, which creates light and maybe also creates a little warmth. And between the fire and the people sitting, somehow there's a stage, some kind of a stage, and then the story goes on that puppets are being passed along the stage. Perhaps somehow who's doing the passing of the puppets is not so clear. Puppets are passing along this stage, and so the people who are sitting with their faces toward the inner wall of the cave can see shadows of the puppets being passed or moving along the inner wall of the cave. Okay, now it turns out that these puppets are, some of them are like stick figures of humans. There are some figures of, let's say, animals, horses. Maybe there's some puppets of plants or trees, things like that. Things that you would see in the natural world. Okay, so again, you've got the fire over here, then you have the stage, puppets passing along the stage, people sitting, they're facing the inner wall of the cave, and they're watching. What are they watching? They're watching not even a puppet show, they're watching the shadows of a puppet show passing along the inner wall of the cave, because, of course, the fire illuminates the wall, and then because of this situation, there's these shadows that are cast on the inner wall of the cave. Okay. Now, what happens is that these people who are sitting inside the cave, they are sort of really fascinated by watching these puppets or shadows of puppets passing along the wall. And they get involved in all sorts of like little contests and games about who knows which puppet is going to pass first, or which puppet is related to that puppet, or what is the relative location of one puppet compared to another puppet, or what is the size of the puppet, and so on and so forth. Okay, so they're living in this shadow world, watching the shadows of the puppets. And then here the parable continues. Imagine if somebody were to, some mysterious person, in the animated version, of course, it's some man with a long white beard, a longer beard than mine, and with some kind of a hat, and he comes down inside the cave. And imagine if he were somehow to free one of these slaves, one of these people who are chained, watching the shadow of the puppet show. Imagine if he were to free him and get him to turn around and suddenly look in the direction of the actual puppets. What would be his reaction? So first of all, he would be sort of confused and bedazzled. His eyes would be kind of blinded by the light of the flame. He wouldn't even really see the puppets. He'd be saying, "What are you doing to me? I want to go back and watch my puppet show. Leave me alone." But eventually, let's say slowly, he would get used to what he's seeing. His eyes would become accustomed to actually looking toward the fire. His eyes would get used to the light slowly. And then eventually his eyes would get used to seeing the puppets themselves. And then he'd begin to realize, oh my gosh, what is going on here? I've been watching shadows of puppets all my life, and now I'm looking at the real things. Of course, we know that those are puppets. So, but he's made sort of a step in the right direction, right? He's made, let's say, and this is already getting into a little bit of an interpretation of the metaphor, which is that this is a metaphor for intellectual growth. That first there's this false sort of world that the person thinks is true, and then he grows up and starts realizing that, no, what I thought was true really isn't the true entity. What really is true is, of course, for him, it's the puppets. Now, of course, the puppets differ from the shadows in certain ways. The puppets are three-dimensional. I don't think this is mentioned in the video, but we can point this out, that one of the differences between the puppets and the shadows of the puppets is that the puppets are three-dimensional, they have a color, the shadows are all going to be kind of black and white, right? Okay, and then of course there's a sort of understanding that the cause, the source of the shadows is the puppets, right? And the shadows are really pale imitations of the actual puppets, which are in some way more real than the shadows, okay? So now you have the guy looking at the puppets and saying, oh, interesting, these are real, this is real. And now the next step is this mysterious person who comes down inside the cave and has managed to release this fellow and get him to look at the puppets. Now what happens? Imagine if this fellow, the guide or the really is in some sense a teacher or an educator, were to somehow get the fellow, the person who was originally chained, get him to come out of the cave. Now, getting out of the cave, let's imagine, if you will, a sort of long and dark cave to get out, right? Okay, well, that would be dark, and it would be difficult, and it would be cold, and the person who was being sort of dragged up out of the cave would be protesting and would be against it. Like, why are you taking me away from where are you taking me to? You're going to kill me. I'm going to die. Or, you're taking me away from this source of warmth and light and familiarity, which I have deep inside the cave, okay? Well, eventually imagine if this person is dragged, kicking and screaming to the mouth of the cave. And as he gets close to the mouth of the cave, you can imagine that he begins to see a light, literally at the end of the tunnel. He sees this great, great light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe as he gets closer, he says, oh, wow, there's a light out there. But then as he gets closer to the mouth, the opening of the cave, then all of a sudden he's now blinded by the light, okay? He's blinded by this light that he has never seen. It's nothing like the light that he saw inside the cave with the fire that was burning there. Now it's really the light that's coming from the sunshine. Imagine that the sun is like beaming down right on the mouth of the cave as this person comes out. What would be his first reaction? The only thing he could see right now would be light and basically nothing else, because he's kind of blinded by that light. So he's going to be scared, he's going to be intimidated, he's going to want to go back inside the cave, he's not going to like this. But let's say that with some encouragement on the part of the person who took him out of the cave, right? He is then encouraged to just be patient, get used to the light, and then slowly but surely he starts looking around, he starts seeing actual things that are outside the cave. Oh my gosh, now he sees a real tree, or a real frog, or a real cow. He sees rivers, he sees oceans, he starts looking around and investigating, he sees birds flying through the air, he sees all sorts of animals and creatures, and then he says, oh my gosh, everything that I saw inside the cave, those puppets are pale imitations of what's truly outside the cave. What's outside the cave is really real. It's the real bird, the real tree, the real river, the real cow, whereas the puppets are phony imitations, pale imitations. I mean, a puppet cow is just not as interesting and wonderful and alive and real as a real live cow, right? So he begins to realize that he has come out of the cave and that he is now getting to know the truth, the real truth about the world. And his prior existence that he had before in the cave was really all a big lie or a fake. Yes, it was sort of real. It wasn't completely wrong, but it was a pale imitation of true reality, which is the reality outside the cave. Then, slowly but surely, he begins to look at the heavens, and ultimately he looks up and he sees the sun, and he starts contemplating the sun, and he begins to learn and understand how important the sun is for everything. The sun is the cause. It gives life to all of the creatures that are on the earth. I mean, we have to take that with a grain of salt, that maybe that's not really entirely true. I mean, is the sun the cause of, let's say, rocks and inanimate matter, but basically everything that's living, everything that's alive on earth has its life from the sun. And the sun is the cause of light by which we are able to see everything. And he's just so amazed by this that something in him, now the allegory goes on. I guess I'm kind of describing the allegory in a little bit more detail than I was planning, but it's a very interesting allegory. I'm sure I'm missing some of the details, but the allegory continues where this fellow now realizes he feels sorry for all the people who are inside the cave, and in some way he wants to go back down inside the cave, but he's kind of hesitant because down inside the cave, I mean, those people that really don't get it, they're attached to their world of the puppets, and they think that that's what's real. And in fact, Socrates mentions that if someone were to go down there and try to release the prisoners and get them to come out of the cave, the people in the cave could be very resistant, and they could be, in fact, so resistant that they might even put such a person to death. But nevertheless, it still is, Plato goes on, Socrates goes on to say, and this is toward the conclusion of the allegory, that this is kind of their duty. Their obligation is to go back down there and to get everyone who they can, to rescue them and bring them upstairs outside of the cave to see the truth, to see the light. Okay, now that is more or less a description of the allegory itself. What is the meaning of the allegory? What do the elements in the allegory stand for? So, if this were a live class, I would probably spend some time with you trying to sort out, well, what do you think the puppets stand for? What do you think the things outside the cave stand for? Who is the fellow who's coming down in there to help get the prisoner out? But since this is not a live class, I'm going to simply tell you what I think, and basically this pretty much comes straight out of Plato himself. More or less, there's certain things that are pretty obvious about how we're supposed to understand the allegory. Okay? And then there may be some things that are not so obvious, but number one, we can certainly say is that, remember we talked last time about particulars and the forms, and that's why this was so important for understanding Plato's theory of the good, because the things inside the cave, whether we're talking about the shadows or we're talking about the puppets, now there is a difference there between the shadows and the puppets, right? But whether we're talking about the shadows of the puppets or the puppets themselves, basically the things inside the cave stand for the particulars of our material physical world. So, for example, someone who thinks that the only things that exist are these physical material things, physical trees, physical bugs, physical people, someone who thinks that the only things that exist are those physical material things, he or she is mistaken. That's wrong according to Plato. That's like being stuck in the cave and thinking that the only things that exist are the things that are inside the cave, meaning the particular physical things of the natural world. What is truly real? That's represented by all the things that are outside the cave, in other words, the forms. So again, the things that are outside the cave represent the forms, the true essences of things. The things that are inside the cave represent the particulars. Now, just to give a little question, to address a little bit the question, what's the difference? Why does Plato distinguish between the shadows of the puppets versus the puppets themselves? Okay, so one way of understanding that is, and this is not the most important thing we're going to talk about today. I'll just say a few words about this. That possibly what Plato has in mind is the following, that when you first begin to, as an infant, as a child, when you first begin to experience the world, you have sensations, right? You have experiences, right? You have, let's say, you're looking at, let's say, a tree, and you have this visual image of the tree. So when you're very, very young, or maybe when you're an infant, you somehow, what's real to you is just the image, okay? The image or the sensation itself is what's real. And then you eventually learn that the sensation of the tree is not the same thing as the tree itself, right? You learn, for example, that when you stop looking at the tree, when you close your eyes, you understand that the tree is still there. When you're an infant, you don't quite make that distinction, right? Maybe you don't make any distinctions at all, but it's just like you're kind of an infant is just sort of a mass of sensations, and the infant doesn't distinguish between the sensations that it's having and the actual object that is the cause of those sensations. Okay, so the shadows of the puppets represent sensations, experiences. The puppets themselves still represent physical things. Either way, what's outside the cave is what's truly real. What's outside the cave is the forms. Okay? Now remember that the forms, according to Plato, are not physical things. They are essences. They are not physical. They are not visible. The essences of things, the forms, triangularity, beauty itself is not something that you can see. It's something you can think of. It's something you can grasp with your mind. Okay, so according to Plato, the forms getting out of the cave represents, in part, using your intellect to grasp truths that are eternal and everlasting, and realizing that those are the real truths, whereas the things inside the cave, i.e. the material, physical things in the world, are really only here today, gone tomorrow. They're not all that important. They don't, in some way, they're not truly real, okay? We'll talk about that a little more, that Plato believes in something which we can call, has been called, a hierarchy of reality or a hierarchy of being, okay? That there are levels of reality, and some things are actually more true and more real than others. The forms are more real than the particulars. Okay, now we need to talk about the sun, because what Plato is saying, Socrates / Plato is saying, is that in the allegory, it's the sun that stands for the good. The sun represents the good in the allegory. Now I want to emphasize that Plato is not saying that the sun is the good. Please do not make that mistake. The sun, the real sun, and again we're talking about S-U-N, the sun that's in the sky. The sun that's in the sky, it's a very impressive, very beautiful thing, but the sun is not the good. Plato is saying that the sun in the allegory represents something which is the good. Now, Plato says that there are 3 ways, this is very important, okay? You might want to take this down. There are 3 ways in which the sun is like the good, or 3 ways in which the good is like the sun. So let's talk about 3 important facts about the sun, okay? And these are just true facts. Number 1, the sun is the cause. I mentioned this already before, but let's get this down as number 1. The sun is the cause of the life and energy of many, many things that exist in the world, right? Without the sun, we would not be alive. Without the sun, there would be no life on this planet. There would be no trees, there would be no animals, no creatures, no life. So the sun is like the generator. It's the cause of life and being in the world. Okay, I guess you got to take it with a grain of salt, because again, the sun, is the sun the cause of rocks? I don't think so. But take it with a grain of salt. The sun is the generator, the cause of life and being, active being on our earth. That's number 1 about the sun. Now, number 2 about the sun is that the sun not only gives life, but the sun gives light, right? The sun is the generator of the light by which we are able to see and get around the world and do what we need to do. In other words, even if we were alive without the sun, it's the sun that lets us see and do things, because without the light of the sun, we would not be able to perceive with our eye anything in the world. Okay, I guess you could imagine, well, if there wasn't a sun, can we still have like the light of the stars, other stars? Okay, well then that's kind of like the sun anyway. If the sun stopped shining, would we still be able to see? Well, can we make fires? Maybe that's possible, but again, basically, the sun is the cause, the generator of light that enables us to see physical things. That's number 2 about the sun, right? And there's a third thing about the sun, which is that in the way the sun is the most impressive, brilliant thing to look at, right? It's an amazing, just think about a beautiful sunrise or a beautiful sunset. But in addition, this is still part of number 3, I'm including this as number 3, is that while it's true that the sun is very impressive to look at, it is also true that the sun is dangerous to look at too closely, that it is dangerous to get too close to the sun. The sun is such a powerful thing that it's very attractive, and yet at the same time, because it's so powerful, it is also something that is dangerous to look at. You can literally, this is a literal true fact, you can actually damage your sight. You can go blind. You probably know this. You can go blind if you stare at the sun for too long. And also, as we know, the sun can cause sunburn. And some people say, I think it's true, I'm not a scientist, but the sun causes people to get sick and die. There's cancer, skin cancer, there's sunstroke. Okay, the heat of the sun, see, there's 2 things about the sun. There's a few things that are true about the sun, right? The sun is this great source of energy and light and life and all that, but precisely because it is this amazing source and cause of light and life, it is also something that you got to be careful about getting too close to it, right? If you got too close to the sun, I don't know how many miles away we are from the sun, but if you went up in a spaceship and got really too close to the sun, you would burn up, right? You would be incinerated because the sun is so powerful. So, summarizing again, number 1 about the sun, and these are true about the sun, not about the good. We're going to talk about the good in a minute. The sun, number 1, is the cause, the source of life and being. Number 2, the sun is the cause of light. It's that which enables the human being and animals to see physical things. Number 3, the sun is a very attractive, impressive, beautiful, important thing. But by the same token, the sun is also a very dangerous and it's a very dangerous thing, such that you don't want to get too close to it too quickly. You don't want to stare at it for too long, because you could hurt your eyes, and if you get too close to it, you could burn yourself or get sick or die, right? Those are 3 facts about the sun. Now, Plato says, well, the sun is like the good. Remember, the sun is not identical with the good. The sun stands for the good. You asked me, remember, this is what Socrates, he's saying to his friends, the characters. You had asked me, tell us, what is the good? What is the good? You've been talking about the good this and the good that. What is the good? I told you I can't tell you what the good is directly. I can only tell you by a metaphor. The sun is like the good. The sun is like the good in 3 ways, okay? So number 1, just as the sun is the cause of the life of physical creatures, so too the good is the cause of all things that exist, including the forms. Okay? The good, remember we talked about the forms. The forms are in some sense perfect and eternal and everlasting. perfect triangularity, perfect beauty, perfect treehood. Sounds a little weird, but that's the theory. These are the forms. The forms are the true essences of things that are eternal. Now, what is the source or the cause? What is it that keeps the forms in being? It's the good. Okay? The good is the cause or the source, in some sense, of all the forms. Sounds a little mysterious, but that's number one. Okay? Number two, just as the sun is the cause of light that enables us to see physical things, so too the good is the source of the ability that we have. It is kind of like the intellectual light that allows the mind to grasp the forms. Okay, think about that for a second. It kind of reminds me a little bit of, in the comics, in cartoons, when some character gets an idea, they often have like a little light bulb that goes on. We talk about, though, I finally saw the light, right? A little light bulb goes on, there's like a click, and a light bulb goes on in your head, and you grasp an idea. Okay, so there's the idea that you're grasping, or the truth, or the thing that you're understanding, but then there's that light. What is that intellectual light? It's not a physical light, like light that you see with your eye, okay? The light in the mind is some kind of an energy that is there that enables you to understand ideas or to grasp truths. So what Socrates is saying is that the good is that which enables, it sort of sends that intellectual light out so that the human mind can grasp ideas, or as Plato would say, understand the forms. So that's point number two about the good. So far we're saying the good is this mysterious thing that is the cause of the being of all things, including the forms, and by the way, including the sun too, because the sun is just another material being, really. The good is the cause of all forms, of everything that exists. The good is also the source by which we are able to understand and to grasp forms. And number three, here's something else about the good. That the good is so amazing and so incredible that just like the sun is very difficult and really dangerous to gaze at directly, so too the good is the most mysterious, bizarre, strange, unusual thing that if you think about it too long, your mind sort of can go crazy. You can become sort of numb in contemplating the good, because the good is so profound, because the good is so basic and so difficult to grasp in a way. It's the most difficult because it's the most basic thing that there exists in the universe. The good is the ultimate source of all things, the source of all light. And therefore, when you think about the good, your mind goes a little crazy. And if you think about the good for too long, it actually might sort of blow out your intellectual circuits. It's like we talk about, we use that phrase, like, right, a mind-blowing idea. What is a mind-blowing idea? Well, it's some kind of an idea that's so amazing and so profound, it's like it just drives you crazy in some sense. Okay, so again, the good, whatever the good is, it's like the sun in three ways. It is the source of all things. It's the source of our ability to understand anything that we do understand. And it is the thing that's the most difficult to grasp, the thing that if we spend too much time talking about it, we're going to go nuts and crazy because it's just so profound. Okay, that basically is a summary of the allegory of the cave and the sun and Plato's description of the good as like the sun in those three ways. Okay, So there are a number of questions that we could ask about the theory. Before we do that, though, I want to go back to a concept that I mentioned briefly, which is something that is important to help us understand the theory of the good. Plato has in mind, Plato believes that there is what I call a hierarchy, a totem pole, if you will, of being or reality. So I'm just going to put on the board over here, try to do this on the board for you, represent what is the hierarchy that Plato believes in. Okay, so first of all, if we can imagine drawing a line to represent it, sometimes it's called the scale of being or the hierarchy of goodness. And at the very top, off the charts, is the good, okay? The good, again, Plato thinks that the good is some kind of an entity. It is an eternal, perfect entity that exists and lasts forever, and it's somehow the generator and the cause of everything that is below it, okay? So the good is at the top, and then the forms are going to be up here. The forms are not as good as the good, okay? But they're pretty close because the forms are perfect. Remember we said that the forms are eternal, invisible, unchanging, everlasting. They are perfect entities, and so therefore the forms are just below, a notch below the good. Now maybe within the realm of the forms there might be a hierarchy as well. That's possible. Perhaps certain forms might be superior to other forms, but let's not get into that right now. Then let's see, a little bit below the forms you would have, let's talk about the gods. We haven't talked much about the gods in Plato or Socrates' scheme of things, but as ancient Greeks, it seems that they believed in some theory of the gods. The gods are, they're kind of like, immortal entities that exist forever, but they're not forms. They're more like sort of, the god of Athens, or the god of war, or the god of the sea, or other various forces that sort of make the world do what it does. But ultimately, the gods get their being from the good, okay? So you have the gods down here, and then let me skip down to, now below here, let's see, over here you're going to have, let's say, animals. Well, let me make this a little bit higher here for animals. Below animals, you're going to have plants. And then pretty down here would be inanimate objects, like, for example, rocks, stones, dirt, earth, okay, stuff that isn't alive, doesn't have any motion, any real being to it, as Plato might say. Now, what's going to be smack dab in the middle is, guess what? Human beings, humans. Now, why are humans higher than animals, you might ask? Why would Plato say that humans are superior? Again, this is, again, a scale of a hierarchy of reality where what's closer to the good is better. What's more farther away from the good is going to be less good. Now, I guess we'd have to say down here that down here is the bad. The bad is, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about, that's something to think about. Actually, we could raise that as a question. If there is such a thing as the good, then what would be the opposite? The bad, well, what is the bad? What would that mean? What kind of an entity, would the bad be some kind of an entity that exists? Okay, so we'll leave that as a question for next time, okay? Next time, in our next lecture, we're going to continue talking about some of the aspects of the good. Next lecture will probably be our last lecture on Plato. We're going to wrap Plato up, and we're going to move on to Aristotle after that. But let's leave their discussion of the bad for next time. But whatever the bad is, you have inanimate objects, rocks, stones, lifeless things. Plants have more life, more energy. They do more, so they're better than the inanimate objects. Then you have animals, and then you have humans. Now, within humans, you have, let's just make it singular just for the sake of discussion. The human being is in the middle. And remember that the human is made up of the soul and the body. And then within the soul, we talked about the intellect, right? The intellect is the highest part of the soul. And so therefore, on the scale of things, the intellect is closest to the good. Now, why is the intellect closer to the good than the body? Well, first of all, because the intellect is able to understand the forms. And in some sense, it's able to grasp the good. Intellectually, we are able to talk and think about the good. And so therefore, since we do that with the intellect, it is the highest part of the soul. Okay, and in fact, in those, we haven't talked too much about this, but Plato seemed to believe there's other dialogues. We did, some of us learned the Phaedo, the dialogue called the Phaedo, which is in one of Plato's other writings where he talks about the immortality of the soul, and pretty much it seems clear there that the part of the soul that is really going to be eternal, if it is going to live after the body dies at all, is going to be the intellect. Okay, so the intellect is the part of the soul that has the greatest kinship with the forms. It has the greatest kinship with the good. And so therefore, of course, the intellect, according to Plato, is going to, once it understands the forms and the good, the intellect is going to direct the spirit. Remember, those are the lower parts of the soul, right? We have the spirit. And then, of course, the appetite is really the part of the soul that is most closely mixed up with the body, right? It's with the appetite that we have lusts and desires. And so that part of the soul, which is the appetite, is actually the lowest part of the soul because it's associated with the body. Now, the body is something that is a particular physical thing that's going to crumple up and die one day and decompose, whereas Socrates thinks that the intellect, now the intellect is not a form. The intellect is not a form. You have your intellect, I have my intellect, and many people have their own particular intellects. So the intellect is really not a form, but it's something that the human being uses to understand and to grasp the forms. And so therefore, the intellectual part of the soul is the highest part of the soul. And these things, animals are more gross, they don't have intellect, or if they do, it's not as intellectual as the intellect that humans have. Plants don't have any consciousness or knowledge at all. Inanimate objects don't even move. They don't have any life. They don't have any energy or being. Well, they have some small, degree of goodness about them, but they are ranked lower than animals and plants even. Okay, we're leaving a question here regarding what is the bad, but this is, again, this is what we're calling, I'll write it down here in case you missed it, the hierarchy. The hierarchy, I hope you can see that, the hierarchy or scale of reality. Sometimes it's called the scale of being, the scale of reality, the scale of truth. Okay, so these things, anything that's closer to the good is going to be more real and more true in some sense than those things that are below the scale of reality. Okay, so it's a scale of goodness, it's also a scale of reality. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the scale of reality. You may have questions about that, and during our discussion section, we can talk about any questions or problems you might see with this scheme of reality that Plato believes in. But this is his theory of the good. So again, going back to wisdom, wisdom is knowledge of the true and the good, and somehow Plato thinks that by having knowledge of the good, if we do get knowledge of the good, which we can, to some degree we have knowledge of the good. It's not easy, it's maybe the hardest thing to understand, but if we have knowledge of the good, then we're going to be able to direct ourselves, control our souls, and become good rulers in an ideal city. Those who have knowledge of the good would be the ideal rulers. Now, there's lots of questions again that one can ask about this theory, but I think one thing I would like to do, I think I'm going to discuss a little bit some of the analogies between Plato's theory of the good and the Judeo-Christian Islamo idea of God. Okay, I use that phrase a little bit with hesitancy because, you know, there are some differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but there is a basic idea of monotheism and the idea that there is one God. The reason why I'm bringing this up is partly because eventually we're going to get to St. Thomas Aquinas' theory of ethics, and so we're going to be talking about the more or less traditional idea of God in at least the Christian perspective, and to some degree there is a commonality between the three major monotheistic faiths in the world, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And there are other monotheistic religions and other monotheistic faiths as well, but the main ones that we're familiar with and which seem to occupy most of the world is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Okay, so in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, which really is a misnomer because it's not really one tradition, but anyway, the idea of God, the reason why I want to talk about God a little bit right now is because, first of all, we're going to get to Thomas Aquinas sooner or later, and he talks about God. But second of all, I think that thinking about the traditional idea of God may be helpful. It could also be a little bit misleading, but it's going to be helpful to us, to me, and maybe to you, I hope, in understanding better what is Plato's theory of the good. Because, as I said, there are several analogies between Plato's theory of the good and the Christian, Jewish, Islamic concept of God, the monotheistic concept of God. Okay, and this is going to represent one of the contrasts between Plato and somebody like Thomas Aquinas. And it will be perhaps helpful for you to consider the differences and similarities between God and the good, Plato's theory of the good, to get a better grasp of what are the differences between Plato and Aquinas. Okay. So we're going to talk about this for a little bit. Now, I'm going to give you, if this were a live class, I would ask you to sort of brainstorm. What do you think? Is there some way in which the good sounds like what you're familiar with as the idea of God? I'm sure some of you are Christians or Jews or Muslims, and so some of you believe in God. And can you find any similarities between what Plato says about the good and what you believe, or what is the whether you actually believe in God or not is not so important for this discussion, but the traditional idea of God is similar in certain ways to the good. Okay, so if we were alive, I would be brainstorming, what similarities are there? What differences are there? But since this is not a live class, I'm just going to continue lecturing a little bit, telling you what I think and what other people have said about this, and that is that there's some very fundamental similarities between Plato's theory of the good and the idea of God. Number one is that traditionally, God is conceived of as the cause, as the source of the universe, right? God is the creator of the world. God is eternal, all right? We've already said, well, actually, Plato thinks that the good is eternal and so are the forms. But the good is certainly eternal. Not only is the good eternal, but the good is the source of all things. Well, God is also understood as the source of all things, right? So that's number one. Number two, just as Plato says the good is the source of that intellectual light which causes or enables us to understand things, so too in the monotheistic tradition, God is the source of our ability to understand and comprehend things. Okay, in fact, there's a verse in Psalms, in the book of Psalms in the Bible, there's a verse which says that in your light we shall see the light, which seems to be an allusion to the idea that because God is like the source of light, the source of energy, the source of light, therefore we are able to understand and to see things, that is to say, see things intellectually because of God's light. And this is a very prominent metaphor throughout Christian, Jewish, Muslim, spiritual, and philosophical discussions, that God is not only the source of our being, but God is the source of our ability to understand both God and whatever it is we're understanding. So that's number two. Now, number three, remember we said the third thing that's true about the good, the way it's like the sun, is that it's the most profound thing, and it's also dangerous to get too close to, too quick. We see this, for example, at least in the Jewish tradition, in the scriptures, getting too close to God too quickly, you could be obliterated, because God is this incredibly powerful entity, and there's a certain reverence, or there's a certain fear that you're supposed to have when it comes to getting too buddy-buddy with God, because you see this actually in the Hebrew scriptures, as I said, in various places in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Exodus, in the book of Leviticus. I'm just giving you examples. You're probably familiar with some of these examples where people get too close to God and they're not quite prepared for it. Well, then they could get fried, literally. So again, and of course, aside from that, there's this notion, when I ask you who or what is God, the idea is, well, God is so profound that it's hard to explain. It's hard to understand. If you think about God too long, maybe you'll go a little crazy, okay? Maybe that's why I'm a little crazy, because I think about God too much. But anyway, what we're seeing so far is that there's several ways in which the idea of God is like the idea of the good. God is eternal, just like the good. God is the cause of all things, just like the good. God is the cause and source of our ability to understand, just like the good. God is dangerous to get too close to, too quick to, just too quickly. God is, and so too is the good. And furthermore, the scale of reality, right? According to Plato, well, God's at the top. Everything else is sort of ranked insofar as it is either closer to God or more away from God. Okay? So, of course, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Christian scriptures, the human being is special compared to animals and plants. Everything is part of God's creation. Just like on this scheme, everything here ranks somewhere on the scale. But still, there's something very special about the human. They're just below, well, of course, in the Christian tradition, you wouldn't have gods, but you do have angels, right? So if you were to Christianize this story here, this hierarchy, you might take out, I don't know what you would do with the forms, that's a good question, but you might take out the gods and put in angels. So angels are spirits that live forever, they don't die, but they're pretty high. They're higher than the human perhaps in some way, but the human is higher than animals. So again, you have an analogy here between not just an analogy, but an overlap here of what the Christian scale of reality would be based on God being at the top, and how things fall along that scheme relative to the good. Okay, so again, that's a little discussion, a little description of in what ways the idea of the good is similar to the idea of God. Now, let's ask this question. In what way or ways is Plato's theory of the good, so far as we've gone through it, in what way or ways is the theory of the good different from, how does it differ from the way God is understood in the monotheistic religions? So, again, if this were a live class, I would ask you to brainstorm, think about that. What can you come up with? So you can turn this off and think about it yourself for a couple minutes. But I'll just keep on trucking and I'll tell you that there seem to be at least one or two things that are very different, okay? And maybe the main one is that the good is impersonal, okay? I'll write that down on the board. At least that's the way it seems, impersonal. Whereas in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions, God is understood as personal, okay? What do I mean by personal? Well, God, a person, what is a person? Okay, sometimes we think of a person as a creature who has a body and has a head and has eyes and nose and a brain. Okay, that's one way of thinking about a person. But another way of thinking about a person is that a person is some entity or being that has rationality and has agency. Okay, rationality and agency. So maybe I should, I'm just going to write those terms on the board for you in case you want to get those down. Person, what is a person? A person is someone who has rationality and agency. These two things sort of go together, but agency means the ability to choose. Sometimes people talk about free choice. Okay, the ability to deliberate and make decisions about what to do. So that's what a person is, okay? As a person, you have the ability to think and deliberate, make decisions, and choose what your decisions are going to be, at least to some degree. Now, in the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God is understood as a person. God, in some sense, is rational and also capable of choice. Furthermore, one thing about persons is that they are capable of interpersonal relationships, such as mutual respect and mutual love. You cannot have an interpersonal relationship with an object that is not a person. You could love it, but it can't love you. You can respect, let's say, a monument, but the monument cannot respect you. If it's a monument, if it's not a person, it is not capable of showing or giving you respect or reverence. So an interpersonal relationship may be in some way the best kind of interpersonal relationship, at least what we normally think of as one of the best kinds of interpersonal relationships, is one of mutual respect and love. Okay? Now, you can only have an interpersonal relationship with a being that is a person. And furthermore, another thing about persons is that they are capable of communication. Communication in words, right? When I communicate to you in words, I send you an email, or I call you on the phone, or I speak to you. Right now, I'm trying to communicate with you in some way. And when you call me or answer a question, you're communicating with me. So rational persons who are rational and capable of choice, are capable of communication. Okay? Now, God is conceived of as a person. In fact, we might say God is conceived of as the supreme person. That's one way of thinking about what does monotheism believe in. Monotheism believes that there is a supreme person of some sort, a rational agent who is the creator and cause and source of the universe. Okay, the good, now going back to Plato, the good is not a personal being. The good is not a person. It seems Plato conceives, again, that's one of the ways in which the good is like the sun, but God is not like the sun. The sun is impersonal, right? The sun is just there shelling out its rays of energy to the world. And God is like that. I'm sorry, mistake. Plato says the good is like the sun. The good is like the sun. It seems like the good is just emanating. It's sharing its goodness with everything else, showering the rest of the universe with its very goodness or being. We'll talk about more the relationship between goodness and being next time, but the good does not seem to be understood by Plato as a person in any way. There are persons. The gods are in some sense persons. Okay, they have choice, they have will, they make decisions, they make mistakes, perhaps. Well, whether the gods make mistakes or not is another question, but perhaps Socrates did not believe that the gods make mistakes. But the gods are persons, but the good itself is not a person. Whereas for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, basically God is at least traditionally understood as a person. And therefore God communicates. And one of the things that Christianity and Judaism and Islam believe in is that God is capable of issuing communications to people. So traditionally, Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe in prophecy, right? Prophecy is where God communicates certain teachings to human beings by speaking or causing people to hear words. Moses, Abraham, Jesus. I understand that Jesus is not understood as a prophet by Christians because Jesus is actually a representation of God himself. But in Islam, you have Muhammad, who is understood to be a prophet, the greatest prophet, according to the Muslims, who heard the word of God preached to him by God himself or through an angel. Okay, so according to Plato, the good doesn't really communicate through prophecy. How does the good communicate, if at all? Well, according to Plato, we use our intellect. We use our rational faculty, the rational part of the soul, to try to understand the good as best we can. That's how we understand what the good is, and by that understanding, we're then able to direct and guide our lives in a good way. Okay? So, for Plato, we don't really have a notion of prophecy, communication. God is not a person. There is no interpersonal relationship with the good. You can love the good, but the good can't really love you. Maybe that's not a fair statement. Maybe in some sense, Plato would say, no, the good does love us, but it's not like the love of a person. You can't have an interpersonal relationship with the good. For Plato, you can't have an interpersonal relationship with the good, but you can have, for Christianity, you can have an interpersonal relationship with God. Now, again, what am I doing here? I've been trying to I'm not trying to say who's right or wrong. I'm not trying to say which view is better or worse, which view is truer or falser. All I'm doing here is trying to explain what the views are. Okay, so I've discussed Plato's theory of the good, and we've talked about some of the analogies, similarities between the Judeo-Christian concept of God and the Platonic or Plato's theory of the good. And one of the things I'd like to do we're going to wrap this up for today. Next time, we still are going to talk about the good a little more. We're going to tie this back into some of the other issues we've seen and discussed with Plato. But one question I'd like to leave you with is a criticism. This is one criticism that actually Aristotle, who's our next major player in this class or course, We're not going to get to Aristotle today, of course, but Aristotle had an objection, a number of objections against Plato's theory of the forms and against Plato's theory of the good. But one objection was the following. Aristotle said, and other people have made the same objection, even if there is such a thing as the good, let's suppose there is this thing called the good, this mysterious thing that's the cause and the source of all light and all life, and it's very hard to understand. Well, even if there is such a thing like that, here's the question. What practical knowledge would it give us even if we were to know the good? What practical knowledge about how to live in real time would knowledge of the good give us? This theory, you might say, Aristotle will say, we've taken leave of ethics and we've flown off into metaphysics, okay? In other words, we were talking about what is virtue, what is good, how do we know what is right or wrong to do, and what is it that makes certain actions right and certain actions wrong? Well, Aristotle's objection is, even if we were to know the good, even if it does exist and we were to know it, what would follow from that knowledge about how I should live or not live? Okay, like for example, we all think that it's somehow, going back to some of our basic examples of what is just or unjust. We believe that it's just to pay back loans. It's just not to steal, not to cheat, not to lie, not to murder someone. Okay, remember we talked about this with the ring argument. Why would somebody not steal or cheat if they knew they could get away with it? So if I know what is good, that should have an immediate impact on my ability to say that, oh, that's wrong, that's right. That particular action is a good action, that particular action is not a good action. The question Aristotle poses is, one of the questions is, knowledge of the good seems irrelevant to everyday moral behavior. It's not a theory that gives us any insight about how we ought to behave, and so therefore it is essentially a useless theory, and therefore we need to look elsewhere, we need to find some other understanding of the good if we're going to have a solid ethical theory. Okay, so I hope that question was clear, and I'm not going to continue with an answer today. I want you to think about that question and think about how might Socrates or Plato answer that question. The question again being, what practical knowledge on a day-to-day basis would, if this theory is true, what practical knowledge or guidance would it give us in terms of how to behave? It seems like, at least according to Aristotle, the theory doesn't give us any practical guidance and therefore it should be thrown out. How might Socrates or Plato answer that question? And we will talk we're going to have one more lecture on Plato. We'll try to answer some of these questions and consider some of the other objections that I mentioned last time regarding Plato's theory of justice and the motivational question. If you recall, toward the end of last class, I had a couple of criticisms, it was at the beginning of last class that I presented a couple of criticisms against Plato's theory of psychic health. So again, going to call it a day for today, and I'll see you next time, and we'll wrap up Plato next time. Have a good day.